Thanks for having me, Adam and all the folks at ARPA-E. It was great to do this talk earlier this year, and it's great to give it again with some updates and changes, and also to have Nat Crew with me here from Ridepal to put it into practice and talk about how we use some of the exercises around storytelling and give you a little bit more sort of credibility and detail about how those function. This talk is about telling your story. And so I'm going to assume that most of the folks here, the participants on the line, have a story to tell, or maybe you just want to be told a good story and that's why you're here. So either way, I'm going to start by actually telling someone else's story. This was a story told by my 4-year-old when it looks like this. He's the one there on the left. So this is a very early moment in storytelling history, and here's the story. Once upon a time, the end. And it made us all laugh, and it made me laugh in particular because he had kind of discovered an essential feature of stories at that age, which is they have frames. All stories are framed. Now, how do we learn this? Where do we learn this? We discover sounds and then words and language, and that's the path to discovering that there are these things called stories, and they have structure. And we're all familiar with the idea of a beginning, middle, and end, but the real question I have is, we all want to hear a story, but how do we learn to tell them? Well, for most of us, we learn to tell stories from listening to people who tell stories. That could be our parents, it could be our grandparents, a teacher, or a mentor, someone we either had to listen to or maybe wanted to listen to. Because at some point, all of us have been captivated, spellbound, hooked by a story. And we learn to tell the stories, that is, frame them just like they did. We copied and pasted their techniques without even knowing it. And that's what was going on with my 4-year-old with Once Upon a Time, the End. He had figured out that essential frame. So we want to have the same power. We want to tell our own story. The problem is, today, the most powerful storyteller isn't really even a person at all. In our Google+, blog, Yelp, WordPress, Facebook, tweeting lives, we're under a tidal wave of stories. An unprecedented volume of new stories washes over us every single day. We're over-indexed in storytelling and storytellers. We have become to think that we are great storytellers because we see so many stories. So if you want to tell your story, and if you're in this room and on this call, then I think you do, then you're going to have to tell better stories, and you're going to have to tell your stories better. So that's what I'm here to talk about, is telling your stories. I'm going to do this in 10 slides, followed by 3 techniques, and then we'll talk about Ridepal, the case study. Okay, so that was me telling you I'm going to tell you a story. That's stage A. That's sort of the once upon a time moment, man. Sort of in a galaxy far, far away. Stage A of telling a story is tell them you're going to tell a story. Always start a story by telling them you're going to tell a story. It can take just a second. It can take longer too. For instance, here's what my research is about. Or my company's vision for world domination. I'm glad you asked. It's a way to basically engage your audience before you actually tell your story. You want to create space for that story to take place. You want to create that frame. You want to make it clear that there is, in fact, a frame before you talk about what's inside that frame. You want to signal you're going to tell that story. It's almost like dimming the lights in a movie theater or turning up the music at a concert. It allows your audience's imagination to open up and be somewhere else. So that's the first part about telling a story, stage A. Tell them you're going to tell a story. Now let's talk about the actual story. A lot of people talk about things like unique value proposition or talking points or marketing messaging. And that's all very important stuff to understand how to sort of tell your story, particularly in a business context. But before we even get to any of that kind of stuff, the meat and potatoes, I want to talk about how you get there. How do you actually find what it is you want to tell your story about? And to do that, we practice an exercise here at Greenstart and in my former company, Frog, called the hook. Now, remember when I said stories are these kind of incredibly important things that people get hooked by, spellbound, and tranced by? Well, the hook is the actual sticky bit. It's the thing you kind of hang your hat on, the thing that your audience can grab onto. And to do that, you need to find something that's real and tangible, because we live in a complex world of ideas and abstractions and processes. it's hard to find what the story is if there's nothing being said. So the hook is an internal activity to identify the nouns and the verbs, or the objects and the actions of your story. For those of you starting a business, it could sound like the unique value proposition, but the point is, it's not dressed up in pretty language. It can seem easy at first. You can look at this and say, oh, I totally know how to do that for my product, or for my research, or for my idea. When you actually go through the activity and exercise, and we're going to ask Nat to talk about that in just a second, you'll find it's much harder than you first thought, because it's about words. And again, we're all such good storytellers, or we think we're all such good storytellers from seeing so many stories, that we get caught up in marketing and taglines and branding. That is to say, things like adjectives and adverbs. So the important thing here is to focus on nouns and verbs. Let me take you through a couple examples, and then we'll talk to Nat, get some examples from her about her process of going through that, and then we'll come back and talk about how you actually use the results of the hook. So the first example we're going to do is Nissan. And in particular, we're going to talk about their car, the Nissan Leaf. Here's their hook. Drivers don't need gasoline. That's it. It doesn't get more complex than that. It's not cars don't need gas. It's not drivers don't need fuel. It's not keeping drivers away from gasoline. And most importantly, it's not saving the world or going green, things that you might see on advertisements, marketing slogans, websites, etc. Because remember, this is an internal clarifying tool. It is not how you publicly tell your story. Once you have your hook, once you internally as an organization or as a group or team agree on what the nouns and the verbs, the basic options, objects and actions are, then you can dress it up in 1,000 different ways. Here's an example of that from Nissan. So that's a great example of breaking down the essence of what story you're trying to communicate first, and then bringing it forward into something much more expressive. And we're going to talk about things like metaphor and analogy and repetition, all techniques that they used in the actual telling of the story after they first arrived at what the essential message is. Let's do another example. You know, I know a lot of folks on this call are very much on the sort of scientific side, their research and development, looking at things at a very deep level that require an immense amount of understanding to even begin to understand what the breakthroughs are that you're developing. Another way of saying that is that science doesn't have to be uncool. And I kind of want to show an example around how to do the exact same trick of the hook, this internal exercise, around something that might seem a whole lot more complex, and show how inside even science and basic deep research lies the same process for being able to tell your story more simply and constructively to an audience. So here is a headline, an article from Reuters explaining a new scientific breakthrough. One of the great things about scientific journalism is it does a really good job of finding the hook for you and often publishing it that way because they can't help but figure it out themselves. So this headline roughly is the hook. Nanotechnology turns plants into common plastic. Now, if you were actually in this research team and you'd been plugging away at this effort for years, if you were these Dutch scientists and you had your breakthrough, you might actually arrive at the hook that sounds more like this. Ethylene and propylene nanoparticles of iron catalysts that synthesize oil-based fuel alternatives. That's not a hook. While it is full of nouns and verbs, you've got to take out your Occam's razor. You've got to make things simpler because simpler explanations are better than complex ones. So another way of looking at this same exact basic research is plants turning into plastic. Now, plants isn't technically right, plastic isn't technically right either, and turning into isn't technically right either. But this, again, is not about being technically right. It's about getting the story tight, not right. And if you can understand how to look at your research and your work and see it through the eyes of an audience that doesn't have the depth and understanding of what you've been experiencing, then you'll have a much better time of going through this exercise of the hook. Just to give you a couple more examples, and then we'll turn over to Nat and talk about the process. Here are some other companies, other brands, to give you a sense of what I mean by basic language and nouns and actions, nouns and verbs. Facebook, it's a website that keeps relationships. Does it do far more than that? Absolutely. Is there a marketing language that they've developed that pushes far beyond this emotionally? Absolutely. But is this the essential action of the story, that the nouns and verbs that they would be telling about themselves? It is. Pinterest, one of the reasons it's so successful as a website was it's a lot like Facebook. And you could say it's the Facebook for your favorite things. And that's because it does essentially the same thing when you tell a story about it. It's a website to keep your favorite things. Gatorade, a drink to replenish energy. Virgin America, airplanes that fly with style. You can imagine on these last two, very strong brands, you could go lots of adjectives, lots of marketing language to express the story. And in fact, these two brands do that quite often and quite well. But before they do, they have to arrive at the essential hook that binds all of their stories together. So now I'm going to invite Nat Crew, founder and CEO of Ridepal, to talk to me today about the case study that we went through here at Greenstart to develop her hook. Nat, welcome. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So the first thing I'm going to ask before we get into it is just basically give people sort of the pitch, the description of what Ridepal is, so that we can kind of talk about how we got there.
You mean very original pitch?
The very original.
The pitch now.
The very original pitch.
Okay. So the very original pitch was actually geared toward commuters themselves, and it was about having a better life, having the ability to use their commute time to themselves.
And maybe for the folks on the call, just a real quick description of what the company does.
And so the way Ridepal was doing this was to say, even if you don't work at a large company like Google or Apple that have shuttles that are paid for by the company and that will carry you from home to work, Ridepal can provide a solution to your commuters because we can aggregate all of you commuters living from one place, arrange for a bus to pick you up from that one place near your home and take you to your workplace. And you all kind of work in similar locations.
And so it's kind of like Google shuttles, the way they work, but now for everyone, all companies in all markets.
Correct.
Cool. And so talk to me about your original marketing language and sort of how you guys came to that on your own.
The way we came to this on our own was really just by talking to people and just listening to their own problems. And like I said, we focused on the riders initially because we actually believed they were the one hurting most, and it turns out wasn't necessarily true. And there were two components in this market, the companies and the riders. And riders were really telling us that what they didn't like about their commute was that they thought it was a waste of time. They would spend a lot of time driving because there was no alternative, and they couldn't do anything else while they were driving. And then the second thing that seemed to be most important to them was their quality of life was not very good. They felt tired, they felt stressed, and most of it had to do with the fact that they were driving. So our marketing language was just saying, you know, these are your problems, and Ridepal can help you eliminate them.
Cool. So very common approach, right? You try to identify what problems your audience has, and then you tell a story in emotional language that draws that you are the solution to that problem. So now we're going to go through and we're going to take a look at 3 iterations of the hook. And as I told you before, it can seem like a simple process from the outset, but it actually takes a lot of sort of mental grinding work to really get there. So the first one, hook 1, talk to me about this.
So when we got to looking at the hook, I think one thing that it forced us to do was to look at the actors in our system, because we were looking at the story from the rider perspective, and we also realized that these riders or these commuters had a relationship with their employers. and we probably could have done that before, but because we were focusing only on one side of the problem, we didn't get to that. And it's actually when we looked at the hook, one question that came up was like, who is involved in that whole relationship?
Those nouns, those basic kind
exactly.
of, yeah.
What are the nouns?
Right.
And initially, when we just had the writers, it just didn't seem right. So this is actually when we started to do a lot more research. Like this hook process led us back to the marketplace, and companies actually came up first in terms of how much they were hurting. And from their perspective, commuting was getting in the way of hiring people and then keeping them. So our first hook actually completely left the riders out and used a very similar approach. Okay, your company, this is your problem, so Ridepal is your solution.
So we switch to the other side now.
Exactly.
And so then hook 2 is interesting because now you're starting to try to balance the two by talking more about yourself.
Exactly. So what the next chapter, when we looked at this first hook, like always the way we were testing it was talking to everyone in the company and say, well, does that represent what we do? Is that the problem that we're married to? And there was something there that was unsettling because the first hook was about riders, the second hook was about companies. So obviously the first comment we get from everyone at the company was like, well, what about the riders now? So that second hook doesn't seem complete. And so the challenge is, okay, how do we marry the two? And we said, well, the only one thing in the middle between the two is the company. So let's talk about the company. So our next hook was, what do we do? And what we do is we take care of all of, the commuting things that need to happen for companies to attract talent and commuters to live a better life. So we'll be the program management for commuting.
Right on.
That was our next hook.
And then hook 3, you sort of came back around.
So hook 3, we came back around, and the reason for that was, it's again, what is, so first of all, let me step back. We realized that really the hook wasn't about the company. The hook is about really a problem or something that the company is really trying to do. The hook was not a statement of identity of the company. It was really a statement of what the company was about. The
story you're trying to tell.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we went away from the second hook, and then we said, okay, well, what is these other relationships that exist between these commuters and the companies? What makes that work? What solves the problem for both riders and the companies? And that was basically what people didn't have today, which was a commute experience they could love.
That's right.
And look forward to. So that was
both
the
sides
next,
happy.
The next hook.
And then that leads us into something we'll talk about after this case study, which is the power of metaphor. Because once you find a hook that works for you, the real power, of course, is how you spin that into a story, how you dress that up in marketing language. And a great way to do that is to sort of think about metaphors and analogies to the kind of story you're trying to tell. And so talk to me about this moment that you had.
So this was actually part of the exercise that was very helpful. Because we're talking about marketing language, we did pick one side. Even though the hook was marrying the two sides, when we were addressing the marketplace, we had to pick an audience. And talking to a company is a different conversation than talking to the riders. So we isolated the company part. And the way we went about this was just searching for images. And so we just entered some terms from the hook for the company. So we actually went back to one of our previous hooks that was still very useful to us. And we put, attractive, we put something around talent, and we had a bunch of images that came up. And then we just sat next to these images and then we said, okay, what seems to be the one that just, seems to embody best what is that we're trying to do? And the one that really came out was like, ultimately these companies need to retain this talent to stand out. They're competing in a marketplace of hiring, and they need to stand out. So they need something that makes them stand out, and that's what a good benefit does. And so that's what the image that came out was, okay, there is one flower in a field of seemingly identical flower. That has to be the flower that was working with Ridepal. And so that's how we came up with that marketing language.
Yep, and it's this notion of this image, this metaphor, has powerfully led to this idea of attracting, right?
Exactly,
and that's the sort of unique flower. And so,
and attracting was also then that, you know, we were looking for the definition of that relationship between the company and the writers, and that is, I think, where we found out what that real relationship was.
That's right. And so now the hook begins to mature into truly the public-facing marketing language, and this is the first sort of step at that. We provide hassle-free, world-class commuting services, blah, blah, blah. But my point here is that adjectives are now being inserted. Words are becoming more dressed up. It's not just basic nouns and actions. Now we're starting to get into it. And this is the simplicity moment, right, is taking something as complex as that statement and essentially boiling it down and keeping the essence of what you've discovered in that hook into this: recruit and retain the best talent. It says nothing about shuttle buses, nothing about transportation. It's a message that both sides can resonate with, particularly the company side. And then what I love is ultimately where it can go, right, which is connecting butts with seats, which is a line that I think, if I remember correctly, is sort of just generally used in the transportation industry as kind of like a joke. Is that right?
The butts with seats, putting butts into seat is an official terminology in the transportation industry. Connecting butts with seats was not used.
Right, there it is, exactly. And so there's that attract, there's that recruit and retrain, even boiled down simpler into just a basic word like connect, butts with seats. And so it's possible to come back all the way from, I'm going to go backwards real quick here, from reclaim your commute time for yourself and live a happier, fuller life, something which, you know, doesn't really say that much, to something with we connect butts with seats, something which evinces the playfulness of the brand as it was developing, and it becomes more akin to what you've discovered in the hook, which is the essential story that you're trying to tell.
That's right.
Cool. Thank you so much, Nat, for your time for the case study.
You're welcome.
You know, once you get this hook down and you begin to express it into language, in marketing language in particular, there are a couple techniques that you can use that I really want to focus on to make sure that your story is stronger than just having a good line. And that's one of those is repetition. You know, the great thing about repetition is repeating things accelerates their essence. I can't stress that point enough, so I'll say it again. Repeating things accelerates their essence. It's a way to tell the signal from the noise. Think about the I have a dream speech, right? You keep hearing the refrain. You keep hearing I have a dream, I have a dream. You know, the it that you want to repeat again and again is the hook. But again, that's a private internal activity. What you're trying to get to is a way of dressing that thing up. And so we've talked about it a little bit here, but what I want to talk about now is how do you get it to become a story? How do you actually take the essence of the idea, the hook that you've developed, and turn it into a story? Well, story is the deep structure of being, and I use a capital B there intentionally. It's actually from Heidegger, so a little bit of a philosophy moment here. But in Being in Time, Heidegger says, what is the being that will give access to the question of the meaning of being? And I have no idea what that means. And his answer, of course, is it can only be that being for whom the question of being is important, the being of whom being matters. The point he's trying to make here is that stories are the deep structure. It's how we hold on to the world. It's in our confusion and our dread of being, capital B, in this world, that we fight against the dark, that we push against that wilderness. We tell stories to stay alive, to stay warm and safe. It's what we do before we dream. They're not abstractions. They really are how we engage with the world. And there are two very profound techniques that we have at our disposal to engage the world at this level with our stories, the truly emotive and deep connection that we can forge over a story. The first is analogy. You know, Douglas Hofstadter has a great line, analogy is the core of cognition. Analogy, this is like that. One thing is logically like another. In part, the car is like a horse. And that's a very logical argument. It's a basic building block of making a logical argument is to use an analogy. But we are as much affective creatures as we are cognitive. We are both head and heart. And if you want to get to the level where story is at the deep structure of being, you need to tell a good story to both. And that's where metaphor comes in. If analogy is this is like that, logically, then metaphor is this is that, directly. It's kind of almost like going from a laptop to an iPad, where instead of tapping the buttons with a mouse and a keyboard at a distance, you're doing it directly with your fingers. Metaphors are the iPads of storytelling. So let me explain. There's a conceptual theory of metaphor, and it suggests that knowledge is structured around mappings in the brain derived directly from physical experience. That is, when I use a metaphor, I'm not appealing to your head and your cognition, but your actual sensate abilities of touching, smelling, seeing, things like that. Now, there have been two camps on this. One says, when you hear a metaphor like, I've had a rough day, you only understand me because you've heard that metaphor so many times, and you've learned that rough means abrasive and bad, and so your brain is toggling quickly from one definition to the other. The other camp says the brain calls on sensory experiences that it has stored, such as what roughness actually feels like, to understand the meaning of the metaphor. Now, recent functional MRI studies on metaphors of texture and touch suggest that the right turn of phrase, the right metaphor, does in fact activate the brain's sensory centers. The researchers scan subjects' brains as they listen to textural metaphors and their literal counterparts. So, he's wet behind the ears versus he's naive. It was a hairy situation versus it was a challenging situation. Now, both lit up the language processing centers of the brain, right, because we are hearing language and processing it. But metaphors also activated the regions of the brain involved in textures and touch. And the same part of the brain does not light up when you listen to the literal versions. So next time someone says PowerPoint is just words and pictures, you can now also tell them it's touch and texture if you use metaphors. I mean, that's pretty awesome if you think about it. Storytelling becomes a physical process, like sticking your fingers into someone's brain and massaging their thoughts out. And the best kind of massage that I've ever discovered is provocation. And the best kinds of stories are provocations, like I have a dream, or most of the things that Steve Jobs was famous for doing on his keynotes. You're moving back and forth between two messages, what is versus what if. And that juxtaposition, that difference between those two, is causing you to try to resolve the answer to what is versus what if. Like a picture like this tries to suggest what could be, even if it's not actually possible. So that's storytelling in a way of thinking about it from deriving your basic hook, your basic idea, and then dressing it up in the language of either an analogy or, more powerfully, a metaphor to both head and heart effectively and cognitively communicate the idea that you came up with during the hook. Now, to end this presentation, I want to talk about 3 quick tips that have more to do with the discourse of storytelling. That is, how you actually perform the story, not what the content of the story is. The first one is your script. Think about how many presentations are going on right now beyond this one. In schools, laboratories, clinics, in Afghanistan, in this building right now, everyone seemingly today uses some kind of visual aid or prop. I don't know about your mom, but mine didn't use PowerPoint, but now my kids use PowerPoint. It's important to understand presentation is both what happens on the screen and what comes out of your mouth. That's the discourse. Now, a lot of people write their script on the screen. They confuse the map for the territory. So here's your first tip. Don't do that. Don't write your script in PowerPoint. Write it in paper. Write it in a word processor. Write down the thoughts that you are trying to communicate first, rather than trying to fit them into a template. And even better for the people on this call who are very well practiced, whether in a research setting or a classroom setting, of giving the same presentation again and again, year after year, to the same audience. Throw away that presentation. Start fresh with a script and think about your idea from the hook activity perspective. Think about the basic nouns and verbs first. Derive your message and then move backwards into dressing it up, and you might arrive at an incredibly different story to tell. Put your script in your mouth where it belongs, and that is off-screen, not on-screen. The second is improvisation. Knowing your material isn't good enough. You need to make it appear that you know your material, but that you're not stiff, that you can react in real time even if you are the only one presenting. You know, there's a game that goes on in most cities worldwide. It's actually an event called Pecha Kucha, and if you've ever been to one, you'll know what I'm talking about. It started in Japan. It's in every major city in the world. It means chit-chat, and all it is 20 images for 20 seconds long, and then you have to present. It's like open mic night for presentations. one great example, or sorry, one great tip I can give you all is look for that in your city. And it's like an open mic night. It's a little nerve-wracking, but try it out. Go on stage with whatever your presentation is, 20 images, 20 seconds long for each image, and try to give your talk to a very willing audience. They'll give you great feedback, and it allows you to improvise and learn the art of telling your story without sticking to your script. And finally, the last tip is 3. 3 is the magic number. Really, it is, and you should use it. And when you're in doubt about how many things to name or list or choose on a slide, it's 3. And why? Well, because we have so much tied up in 3. Beginning, middle, end, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, setup, conflict, resolution, love triangles. We expect 3. You should deliver on 3. It's what people are expecting. Of course, the great thing about 3 is that you can then break it once you said it. And so I'll say one more thing for tips, and that is this idea of battle decks. It's something we did actually at ARPA-E, I think with great success. Very hard to explain on the phone, much better to live it and feel it. But what I can recommend is get a friend to put together 5 images in a PowerPoint deck that you've never seen before. And then give yourself 2 minutes in the mirror, in a camcorder, or to that friend to try to pitch or give a presentation or tell a story to those 5 images that you've never seen before. The better that you can map what you're telling to the random images that are put on screen, the more connected, fluid, and improvisational you will be with your story. It's another rehearsing technique like improvisation, only it's even stronger because it makes you realize how on or off message you are at any given moment, depending on the circumstances. So those are the 3 tips, really 4, and that was me telling the story, part B, of the overall structure of how to tell a story. I opened up by telling you I'm going to tell a story. I then told you a story, in this case about storytelling, and now I'm going to do the thing that you need to do to end the story, to complete the frame of the story, and that's tell you I just told you a story. You know, my story, because it's a story, also has a structure and therefore also had a hook, and my basic nouns and verbs were story, telling, to an audience. That's you. I told you how to tell stories better, and I told you how to tell better stories, things like analogies, metaphors, repetition, provocation, and the hook. And so now it's time to raise the lights, turn off the music, finish the frame, to close the story, and bring it to an end. Because unlike Once Upon a Time, the end is the hardest part of telling a story. You've got your audience to open up their mind, to engage emotionally with you on the story. They've believed, ideally, what it is you were trying to tell them. And now you actually have to tell them it's over. You have to make the magic go away. And for most of the time, nothing is final. We're always kind of in the middle. That's why closure is so hard. The projects keep going, the research keeps going, the presentation may end, but the conversation keeps going. And with that, I'll end on this presentation and turn the floor back over to ARPA-E, and I think Adam or Alon, and ask if there's any questions that I can answer about this process, the hook, or otherwise.
Great. Well, thank you very much, David. And I really appreciate as well Nat's contribution in hearing her experience. We do have a fair number of folks on the line, so if you've got your WebEx browser there, look for the Q&A box, notably not the chat box, but the Q&A box, and you can submit some questions. And David, if you see that box there, they should come in as well. But I'd like to start off. I'm sorry?
Sorry, yeah, I got it up.
Okay. And but I'd like to start off just by doing a couple things. First off, we had someone ask, how do you spell the Pecha Kucha, or maybe that's something that a bad spelling into Google can help us synthesize. But some folks wanted to know about that.
Yeah, let me go ahead and make sure I get the correct spelling, and I'll just type it into the Q&A window there for everybody. Okay, it's Pechakucha, and I can't send it in the Q&A window. I guess I can't ask myself a Q&A. Is that the problem here?
You could put it into the chat.
Yeah, I'll put it into the chat.
Okay, and we'll also send that around to everyone that's on the line as well. I wanted to ask, I'm sorry?
I was going to type in I'll also add the URL in there as well so people can see which city is closest to them. There you go.
Perfect. Okay, there we go. So one question was thinking about the essence of the story and talking about the what is versus the what if. And what that struck me as something for particularly people who are working on is something that might be pretty esoteric. It might be a power electronic component that is not something easily understood. You know, we have people, especially here at ARPA-E, but throughout the energy technology landscape, that are working on a part of a balance of systems. But I just wanted to see, especially in your experience, I know Greenstart made a transition from focusing on one portion of the energy technology world to another. But if you had maybe just an experience with someone that sort of, that struck me, the idea of talking about the what is versus the what if could even really help something that at first, you know, seemed like a very small component of a larger system to kind of bring out its magnitude and its impact.
Yeah, and there's a great presentation online at a TED conference by a woman named Nancy Duarte, D-U-A-R-T-E, in which she went through and analyzed great speeches in history like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, like Steve Jobs' keynotes, and many others that we're familiar with, specifically on the idea of provocation. And what you realize in her mapping is that what provocation is doing is something very similar to what we see in preaching, in motivational speaking and coaching, which is generally to whip your audience up into a frenzy by constantly balancing in time the differences between what is and what could be. So if you think about it, what we're all engaged in, particularly the audience folks, the members that you just mentioned, is we are trying to design solutions to problems, right? We have identified that there is a problem in the world, and we are trying to design the solution for it. Dieter Rams, a great designer, once said, design is an argument about the future. And I think that's what provocation is most sort of credibly identified as, is it's an argument about what could be. And so when you're trying to express in a story what it is your solution to the problem that you've identified, then casting that as a provocation by saying not just what it is that I'm doing and here's its solution to the problem, but what it is that I'm doing could lead to this kind of future. It could be this kind of world that we live in. The image that I showed there, you could imagine what it would be like if we could all control our cars, big and small alike, by a remote control. Now, I could just focus on the idea, if I was maybe the engineer behind that project, I've created a wireless frequency modulator chip that allows me to insert it into any transportation. It's like, but then that's not really a story. That's just basically describing the solution to the problem. By casting your solution in context to the world we could be living in, the argument for the future, you'll much more likely engage your audience with the problem that you are solving, and more specifically, your solution, because now they can grasp it, they can put it into their own mind. And if you do that with metaphor, better than analogy, but either, then you'll do that even more emotionally, right? You'll appeal to their heart as much as their head in the future that you're talking about, in the argument that you are designing.
You know, and what strikes me about that is what Nat said about her process. She said, you know, we got out there and we talked to people and we listened to how they describe their own problems, which is a little reminiscent for those folks that were here for Steve Blink's presentation. His big secret sauce for building your business model was to get out and talk to customers. And so it sounds like, you know, maybe for the technologist in the lab, that you might have a good handle on the ins and outs of the scientific challenges that you're working on, but you might be framing those in a way that the end user might not describe their problem in the same way. And so as you're saying, to connect the head and the heart with analogy, that would be, I'm sure you have some, I'm sure the Greenstart, the companies that work with Greenstart have some pretty wild experiences going out and talking to their customers. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about Greenstart? We had one question come in asking you to elaborate how Greenstart helped ARPA-E. Greenstart helps other technology companies. So there's the friendship between David and ARPA-E is that exactly the friendship. There's no official partnership, but just to give folks a little bit of an idea of what Greenstart does, and then.
Yeah, sure.
Great.
There is a little bit of an official partnership, only in that we are a judge on the Sunshot on the DOE Sunshot program. So kind of cousins to some degree. But what Greenstart's job is to focus on work with startups in the digital clean tech space, and so that's just basically thinking about traditional clean tech as we all understand it, but that uses software in some fashion, right? So it could be the central business model or innovation is software. It could be the distribution mechanism is software. But we're really interested in kind of thinking that what happened to, let's say, mobile and is happening right now to retail and transportation and happened to media, what digital technology did to those industries, it's going to do in some fashion to the energy or clean tech industry. So we work with startups who are practicing or have products and services in that space, and our job is essentially to make them better by telling better stories, having better brands that tell those stories, and most critically, helping them design the products and services themselves. And so that's everything from a mobile phone app to, we recently, like Ridepal, who you just met, literally talking about what is that shuttle experience. What is it like when you get on? What does it look like at the stops? What is the online ticket buying process like? So it's the full experience of what a product or service experience could be, plus, as I said, the brand and also the storytelling, the pitch itself. So it's really kind of a workshop environment for startups in that space.
Excellent. One good question here is elaborating on how storytelling has changed or maybe changes depending on the communication tool, and the person lists a couple of different mediums, website, video, and podcasts. And so I guess, especially with companies that sometimes, today's presentation, I think, was focused on delivering it live. The hook, I guess, process can feed into any different channel. But any thoughts that you have on how the story should evolve as you use different communication tools, whether they're websites, video, podcasts, things like that?
Absolutely. I think it's really important to recognize that while your story will change depending upon the medium of its discourse, that is to say, whether it's PowerPoint or a movie or a forum like this, which involves kind of remote voice, the two things are separate. You really should try to understand what you're communicating as content or narrative and discourse, right? So there is the actual messages that you are trying to get across and the hook as one technique for doing that. But then there is the actual discourse and all the kind of props that you use to tell that story. And there is no best method. In fact, more often than not, you're shoehorned into a discourse method, right? If you're talking to a venture capitalist, they'll want to see a 15-slide deck or something like that. If you're in the elevator, then all you have is a 1-minute conversation, right? So more often than not, it's not about choosing the best medium to tell your story, but trying to find a consistency across all the mediums and keep your narrative, your content, your story, so to speak, as similar as possible across all of those. And so while it's true that images and video and visually rich mediums will be more successful at the affective, the emotional storytelling quality, the same is true, you can be as affective and emotionally engaging with just your voice and your body language. And I have to say that's something which a lot of the startups who come to Greenstart are very surprised to not learn, but actually experience and discover, because at the end of our program, we have a sort of a big pitch day where they get in front of about 300 investors. And so it's very much their body language and their confidence, the tonality, the amount of pacing, where you put your hands when you're talking. All of that is equivalent to the slides, the images that you might use in PowerPoint. And many of us feel either too confident or unable to ask for coaching or for help from our friends or professionals around that discourse side of storytelling. But it is as important if you want to tell an affective, emotional story as the images that you might use as well. So for me, I'd say there's a lot more work we can all be doing on that side of discourse than worrying about whether or not I've got the right template for the slides that I'm showing.
Great. Well, that is really helpful, and I think also just emphasizes what might be painful advice to hear, which is just practice. You know,
it is practice, 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 and as a result, one thing I want to very clearly, you know, there isn't any kind of magic to any of this. It really is more of a confidence game, and the way that you can get there is just ask people who you trust, who are closest to you, friends, family, colleagues, to participate with you in these activities. You can't develop the hook on your own. You will be trapped in your own mind and use your own words. Ask your mom, you know, ask the layman to look at the thing you've written, basic nouns and verbs, and see if they understand it. Ask your friend to suffer through a 5-minute pitch of yours with the battle deck images, random images, and you'll find that, well, it may not be in the best interest of their time, it will remarkably increase your abilities. But you need to reach out to these people and engage them, though they may have no idea what you're doing, in the practice of storytelling.
Right, right. Well, and I think as well, the point, I just wanted to bring it up again, that you had said, you know, you might be a career professor, you've given lectures every day for 30 years, but you might have been rehearsing to reach a different audience than that you're going to go reach whenever you need to sit in and present to, whether it's venture capital or whether it's just another research team where you're trying to recruit a new partner for your project. So not just practice, but also recognizing the need that you might have already done some rehearsing, but you might need to do some different type of rehearsing to be really effective.
Yeah, I can say with certainty, every startup that comes into the program within, I think it's week 1, day 1, we throw those slides away. And we may actually end up on the end of the program 90 days later with bringing a lot of it, if certainly not some of it, back in. It's just that you can't make progress on developing a new story, or most critically what you're talking about, speaking to a new audience, if you're using an old story that you've sort of built a battle, sort of a wall around you, feeling comfortable and safe that you know that material. Just because you feel confident and safe that you know the material doesn't mean you're achieving your goal of communicating that material successfully to all the audiences that might or need to know that material. So the exercises of today, the idea of reaching out to other people, the tips that I shared, all of those will help you essentially throw out your existing PowerPoint slides. Starts from scratch. It's a hard process, blank canvas, but you know, take these exercises to heart, go through them, and you'll arrive back at something which, even if it's not the best new presentation, I'm sure you'll find improvements to the one you're currently doing.
Now, we have an interesting, 2 different but related questions, and both kind of about convention in presentations in the technology world. One person is asking, you know, what should be the kind of the proficiency or the credentials of the person presenting? If you have a small team and you're going in because of the need, as you've been talking about, to connect with both the head and the heart, should you put maybe your best presenter, the most natural presenter forward, versus someone who is maybe the most expert at the technical material you're covering? And a related question, and answer either of them or none of them. A related question is, you know, saying like there's a lot of people advising at these conferences to just stay with a very strict, you know, focus on just the facts, and that there might be some concern about kind of looking like you're going rogue, or you're maybe being catchy, or following a fad and following this different approach. So how would you kind of balance the tension, I guess, where, you know, people want to be taken seriously and be seen as expert, but at the same time, as you're advising, having the ability to connect with, you know, words, pictures, analogies, things like that?
Sure. So I'll come back to the Heidegger line of stories are the deep structure of being. There is not a single soul on this planet who does not want to hear a story. It's what every child asks before they go to bed, and it's why we turn the TV on. We all want to hear a story, and we may use different language to say that. We may say things like, I want to understand your business plan, or I want to understand what research breakthroughs you've achieved. But fundamentally, if you're going to engage in a conversation like that, you are telling a story. So the degree to which you kind of go rogue or go off script or try something out that's not traditional is only a factor of your confidence in delivering that discourse of the content that you have. So what I would suggest is, if you want to be different because you want to stand out, okay, you can do that, but if you're not confident in your ability to do that, if you've not practiced it and rehearsed it and done the exercises to test it against your various audiences, then you will look like a bad storyteller and it will backfire against you. So it kind of follows along with the answer that I would give to the first question, which is you always want your best storyteller to give the presentation. The caveat being they need to be able to answer questions, that is to continue the story even after the frame of the story has been closed. And so it's very convenient when you have a forum where there are no questions, where it is not a conversation, it is a one-way storytelling, like TV is a great example of that. And that's why they put the best storytellers on TV, the actors and the writers themselves. In a two-way experience where there's Q&A, you just have to be mindful that your sort of best hitter, your best pitcher, or whatever, the best storyteller is not necessarily going to be the answer, because they actually have to follow through with that story into all the details, the sort of the fractal edges of all possibilities that that story might create. There's provocations, there's arguments that they might create in the minds of the audience. So if you're feeling confident about your ability to tell stories, go with it, no matter what the format requires, because everybody wants a good story. And if you've got a good storyteller on your team, and they know the material enough to kind of handle the follow-up to the story, then go with that person, even if they aren't the, so to speak, first person, the original person who has come up with the idea.
Right. So title, position on the team, not necessarily as essential as having the ability to bring both of those to bear. Now, we have another question here that I think also can ring true to anyone who's attended a conference, but it's about length and understanding, what is, I think it would be great if there was a proper, rule of thumb in every case. Obviously, it's situational, but what would be your guidance on people as they think about length? So I think the average conference goer would say, people's presentations are too long, and they, it's not just that they're putting the script on the page, but that they're just trying to present too much information. But with things that are, technical as they are in the energy technology space, how do you counsel people to hit that right balance?
Yep. There is no there is no number in the sense that one number is better than others. I've done presentations of 100 slides in 5 minutes, and I've done presentations with 0 slides in an hour. The real question that's kind of up for grabs, though, is how do you keep your audience engaged with you no matter what the time is? There probably is an upper boundary, right? I'm sure at some point after hours and hours you have to go to the bathroom. But what movies teach us is you can definitely go for about 2 hours, 3 hours and engage an audience in a story. So it's not that the upper boundary or minimum boundary is the issue. It's what are the ways in which whatever story you're telling, you keep people along for the ride with you. And one tip that sort of is thread throughout all of this material, and I hope you picked up on, and in specific I talked about with the idea of the number 3, which you saw repeated ad nauseum throughout my presentation, is if you sub-structure your presentation and you give people clear demarcation points when you have begun one section and ended the prior, they are more willing to follow along with you. So you heard me often say things like, I have 10 slides and I'm going to go through those, or I have 3 tips and I'm going to go through those. Every time I use that technique, you are just that much more likely to follow along with me than not, because you know that there is a finite end to what I'm doing. But the trick that I'm pulling is that I'm constantly doing that. And I could, for hours, if I'm a very good presenter, and I'm not quite sure I'm there yet, I could keep stringing those tricks along, saying, I'm going to tell you this many things. And when this many things come to pass, I then reveal the next many things. And that kind of gating, that kind of thresholding of only revealing a certain amount of detail about what's to come in the future, so that your audience patiently waits for that to happen is a great way to keep that rhythm going of the presentation. Now, that doesn't absolve you from having to be engaging and evocative and emotional during the time you're actually doing those 10 or 3 slides, but that's a great technique to extend or to deal with the sort of length that you feel you have to get through without actually making it seem like it's an infinitude of hundreds of slides in a deck that has no beginning, no middle, and no end.
Excellent. No, that makes sense, and it's basically providing it in bite-sized portions. You know, you don't need the steak all at once. You got to cut it up.
Yes, that's right. And think of those bites as different sizes too, right? It gets very boring if you say, I'm going to do 3 things and then 3 comes to pass. I'm going to do 3 things and 3 comes to pass. I'm going to do 3 things. Like, that can seem infinite as well. So it's about varying those bite-sized portions, small, then large, then small, then medium. You can actually chain together those bite-sized pieces for quite a long time.
Well, David, we really appreciate your presentation and sharing your thoughts with us today. And I know that it's been really neat to watch the coverage of the Greenstart participants that you guys have had. And I encourage everyone on the phone, if today was the first time that you heard of Greenstart, check out their site and check out what their companies and participants are doing. I think that there's a lot that can be learned, and we appreciate the openness, David, that you guys have had on some of the tools that you use, the hook, the battle decks. I did want to mention to everyone, if you want to see the examples of some people trying out the battle deck practice tool, we have the video of David's presentation from this last February, and some 3 very brave individuals who came up and gave that a shot. But again, I would say it's not often in the very cost-intensive world of developing technology that you get a lot of free advice that you can go execute with your team with no startup cost. So thanks again, David, for your participation today. It was great to have you.
Thank you, and I'll send you these slides right now so everyone on the phone who would like them can have them as well.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And if you do have, when you get the email with his slides later today, if you do have thoughts, suggestions, feedback on today's program, or suggestions for future topics that you'd like to see us cover here at ARPA-E University, or it could be a topic or a person, please email me, Adam D. Luzansky. My information will be in the email, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.